The blood on Violet Zimmerman's hands had long since dried, but she still saw it every time she closed her eyes, still felt the weight of what her husband had done in her name. She stood at the window of her small boarding house room in Fargo, North Dakota, watching the dusty street below as another scorching July day in 1882 began to unfold, wondering if she would ever feel clean again. 3 months had passed since that terrible night when Marcus, the man she had pledged her life to at 19, had killed a traveling merchant in cold blood over a poker debt. She had witnessed it all from the doorway of the saloon, where she had gone searching for him after he failed to come home. The horror had frozen her in place as Marcus stood over the body, claiming self-defense, though everyone present knew it for the lie it was. He had looked at her then, his eyes wild and desperate, and told the sheriff it was true that the merchant had drawn first. Violet, paralyzed by shock and the years of manipulation that had taught her to fear Marcus more than she feared hellfire itself, had nodded. She had confirmed his story. The merchant's widow had stood in the courtroom and stared at Violet with eyes that held oceans of grief and accusation. 3 children had clutched at their mother's black skirts, their faces pale and bewildered. Marcus had walked free, his hand possessive on Violet's shoulder as they left the courthouse, his grip tight enough to bruise. That night, he had celebrated his acquittal with whiskey and cards, and when Violet had finally worked up the courage to tell him she could not live with what they had done, he had struck her so hard she had seen stars. She had left the next morning while he slept off his drunk, taking only what she could carry in a worn carpet bag. The stagecoach had brought her north to Fargo, away from everything she had known in Bismarck. She had hoped distance would bring peace, but the guilt followed her like a shadow, settling into her bones until she barely recognized herself in the mirror. At 23, Violet felt ancient, hollowed out, as though all the good parts of her had been carved away, leaving only this empty shell that moved through the days without purpose or joy. The boarding house keeper, a stern widow named Mrs. Patterson, had given Violet work washing linens and preparing meals in exchange for her room and a small wage. It was honest work, the kind that left her hands raw and her back aching, but Violet welcomed the pain. It felt like penance, though she knew no amount of scrubbing could wash away what she had done. She spoke to no one unless necessary, kept her eyes down, and tried to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She had been in Fargo for 2 weeks when she first saw Franklin Gates. It was market day, and Mrs. Patterson had sent Violet to purchase vegetables from the farmers who set up their wagons near the town square. Violet had been examining a basket of carrots when a commotion erupted near the livery stable. A horse, spooked by something, had broken free from its hitching post and was rearing and bucking wildly, scattering people in all directions. A young boy, perhaps 6 or 7, had frozen in the animal's path, too frightened to move. The man who came running seemed to appear from nowhere. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the worn denim and leather of a working cowboy, his hat pulled low against the summer sun. He moved with a confidence that spoke of years in the saddle, placing himself between the boy and the panicked horse with no regard for his own safety. Violet watched, her heart in her throat, as he caught the horse's trailing reins and began speaking in a low, steady voice. The words were too quiet for her to hear, but their effect was immediate. The horse's ears swiveled forward, its wild eyes gradually calming. Within moments, what had been a dangerous situation resolved itself into the man gently stroking the horse's neck, while the boy's mother rushed forward to gather her son into her arms. Violet had turned away then, unsettled by the scene in a way she could not name. There had been something in the man's deliberate calm, in the way he had placed himself in danger without hesitation, that reminded her of everything she had lost. She had once believed in heroes, in goodness, in people who chose to help rather than harm. Marcus had beaten that belief out of her one disappointment at a time. She saw Franklin Gates again 3 days later at the general store, where she had gone to purchase thread for Mrs. Patterson. He was at the counter paying for supplies, his voice polite as he thanked the shopkeeper. Up close, Violet could see he was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of good whiskey. There was a kindness in his face that seemed genuine, not the false charm Marcus had worn like a mask during their courtship. "Excuse me, madam," he said, noticing her waiting behind him. He stepped aside, tipping his hat politely. Violet nodded, unable to meet his eyes, and moved forward to make her purchase. Her hands shook slightly as she counted out her coins, and she hated herself for the weakness. She had become so accustomed to fear that even simple courtesy from a stranger made her nervous. "You are staying at Mrs. Patterson's place," Franklin said, and it was not quite a question. When Violet glanced up sharply, wary, he held up a hand in a peaceable gesture. "I do not mean to intrude. My family owns the ranch just outside town. We do business with Mrs. Patterson sometimes, and I saw you there last week when I delivered beef. I am Franklin Gates." "Violet Zimmerman," she replied, the words barely above a whisper. She clutched her small package of thread and turned to leave, wanting only to escape the discomfort of conversation. "Wait," he called after her, and against her better judgment she paused. He came closer, his expression uncertain but hopeful. "The church is having a social this Sunday. There will be music and dancing. I wondered if you might consider attending. It is a good way to meet people, and the ladies always bring fine food." Violet shook her head, already backing toward the door. "I do not attend socials. Thank you for the invitation." She fled before he could say anything else, her heart pounding, as though she had narrowly escaped some danger. But later, alone in her room, she found herself thinking about the warmth in Franklin's eyes and hating herself for noticing, for wanting even for a moment to believe that a man could be kind without some cruelty lurking beneath. The following week brought a break in the summer heat when afternoon storms rolled across the prairie, turning the streets of Fargo into rivers of mud. Violet was hanging laundry in the boarding house's back garden when she heard shouting from the direction of the river. She paid it little mind at first, accustomed to the various disturbances that marked life in a frontier town. But the shouting grew more urgent, and soon she could make out words. "Someone help! There is a man in the water!" Violet's hands stilled on the wet sheet she had been pinning to the line. Against her will, her feet carried her toward the commotion. A small crowd had gathered on the riverbank, where the Red River ran high and fast, with rain runoff. She could see a figure struggling in the current, being swept downstream toward where the water grew deeper and more dangerous. Several men stood on the shore, shouting advice but making no move to enter the treacherous water themselves. Then Franklin Gates pushed through the crowd, already shrugging off his coat. He kicked off his boots with efficient haste and waded into the swollen river without hesitation. Violet's breath caught as she watched him dive beneath the surface, fighting the current with strong, sure strokes. He reached the struggling man, a weathered prospector by the look of him, and got an arm around him. The journey back to shore was agonizing to watch, as the current tried repeatedly to tear them apart or drag them under. But Franklin's determination was absolute. He hauled the half-drowned man onto the muddy bank, where others finally rushed forward to help. The prospector coughed up river water and gasped his thanks. Franklin simply nodded, accepted his coat and boots from someone who had gathered them, and walked away as though he had done nothing more remarkable than cross the street. Violet stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, watching him go. There had been no show of bravado, no demand for recognition or reward. He had seen someone in need and acted as simple and pure as that. Something cracked in the ice that had formed around Violet's heart. Not much, just a hairline fracture, but it was enough to let in the first shaft of painful light. She began to see Franklin more frequently after that, though whether by chance or his design she could not say. He would tip his hat to her when their paths crossed on the street, his greeting always respectful and never demanding more than she was willing to give. Sometimes he would stop to chat with Mrs. Patterson when he delivered beef or picked up his family's laundry, and Violet would hear his voice from the kitchen, warm and genuinely interested, as he asked after the widow's health and listened to her complaints about her rheumatism. That Franklin Gates is a good man, Mrs. Patterson announced one evening as Violet helped her prepare supper. His father, William, raised him right after his mother died. The ranch does well enough, and Franklin works harder than two men. He has been asking about you. Violet's hands stilled in the bread dough she was kneading. What does he ask? Where you came from? If you are married? If you are spoken for? Mrs. Patterson gave her a shrewd look. I told him you wore a ring when you first arrived, but have not worn it these past weeks. I told him you seemed like a woman running from something, and that if he had any sense, he would leave you be. Thank you, Violet said quietly. I also told him, Mrs. Patterson continued, that you were the hardest worker I have had in years, that you never complained, and that you had a sadness in you that suggested you had known real trouble. He said that was all right. He said troubled people sometimes make the most loyal friends once they learn to trust again. Violet's vision blurred with unexpected tears. She bent her head over the bread dough, kneading it with more force than necessary. I am not looking for friends. Perhaps not, Mrs. Patterson agreed. But sometimes what we need finds us anyway. August arrived with its relentless heat, turning the prairie grass golden and making the air shimmer above the dusty streets. Violet established a routine that carried her through the days. Rise before dawn, prepare breakfast, wash linens, prepare lunch, mend and iron, prepare supper, clean the kitchen, collapse into bed too exhausted to dream. The work was endless, but she clung to it as a drowning woman clings to driftwood. She was in the general store again, purchasing coffee and sugar for Mrs. Patterson when she heard a name that turned her blood to ice. Marcus Zimmerman rode through yesterday, a cowboy was telling the shopkeeper. Asked if anyone had seen his wife. Said she ran off some months back and he has been tracking her north. Described her as small, dark-haired, real pretty. Said she was not in her right mind when she left, that she needed help. Violet's hands went numb. The coins she had been counting slipped from her fingers and scattered across the wooden floor. The shopkeeper looked over at the sound, as did the cowboy. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the coins, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Marcus was coming. Marcus was looking for her. He would find her, and when he did, he would make sure she never ran again. Madam, are you all right? The shopkeeper's voice seemed to come from very far away. I am fine, Violet managed, though her voice shook. She gathered the last of the coins with trembling fingers and thrust them toward the shopkeeper, no longer bothering to count them. Please, just the coffee and sugar. She fled the store, packages clutched to her chest, and ran blindly down the street. She had no plan, no destination. Panic had taken over, the same paralyzing terror she had felt in those final months with Marcus, when the violence had escalated and she had known deep in her bones that he would eventually kill her. She could not go back to that. She would rather die than go back to that. She collided with someone, would have fallen if strong hands had not caught her shoulders. Easy now, Franklin Gates said, his voice calm and steady. Easy. What happened? Violet shook her head wildly, trying to pull away, but his grip was gentle and firm. I have to go. Please, let me go. You are safe, he said, and something in his voice made her look up into his face. His whiskey-colored eyes were serious, concerned but not pitying. Whatever scared you, you are safe right now. Breathe. She tried. She forced air into her lungs and then out again, focusing on Franklin's face as though it were an anchor in a storm. Gradually, the panic receded enough for rational thought to return. She became aware that they were standing in the middle of the street, that people were watching, that she was making a scene. Shame washed over her, hot and bitter. I am sorry, she whispered. I am sorry. I should not have bothered you. You did not bother me, Franklin said firmly. Come on, let us get you somewhere quiet. He kept one hand lightly on her arm and guided her down a side street to a small park area behind the church where a bench sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree. He waited until she sat, then lowered himself to the other end of the bench, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Now, tell me what frightened you. Maybe I can help. Violet shook her head. No one can help. He will find me, and when he does. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Your husband, Franklin said quietly. It was not a question. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks despite her best efforts to hold them back. I left him. I had to leave him. But he is looking for me, and he will not stop until he finds me. Marcus never lets go of what he considers his. Franklin was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. Did he hurt you? Yes. The word came out barely louder than a breath. And worse, he made me complicit in something terrible. He killed a man, Franklin. Shot him dead over a card game, and then made me lie and say it was self-defense. That man's widow and children lost everything because of what we did. Because of what I did. What he did, Franklin corrected gently. If you were afraid enough to lie for him, then you were a victim too. I should have been brave, Violet said bitterly. I should have told the truth no matter the cost. Instead, I was a coward, and an innocent man's family suffered for it. Franklin reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, warm and solid. Surviving is not the same as cowardice, and running took more courage than you give yourself credit for. He squeezed her hand gently. Let me help you. If this Marcus comes to Fargo, he will have to go through me to get to you. Violet wanted to believe him. She wanted it so badly her chest ached with the longing. But she had learned the hard way that promises were easy to make and harder to keep, and she could not bear the thought of Franklin getting hurt because of her. You do not know what he is like. He is dangerous, and he does not fight fair. Then it is a good thing I do not fight alone, Franklin said. My father and the ranch hands, the sheriff, half the men in town owe my family favors. If your husband comes here looking for trouble, he will find himself outnumbered. He turned on the bench to face her fully. Violet, you have been carrying this burden alone for too long. Let someone help you. Let me help you. She looked into his eyes and saw only sincerity there. No calculation or hidden cruelty. It terrified her, that openness, because it made her want to trust again. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk so much for someone you barely know? Franklin smiled, a small, sad expression that made him look older than his years. My mother died when I was 14. Fever took her in the space of 3 days. Before she passed, she made me promise something. She said the world had enough cruelty in it, and that the only way to fight back was with deliberate kindness. She made me swear that whenever I saw someone hurting, I would help if I could. He brushed a thumb across her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made Violet's throat tighten. I can see you are hurting, Violet. Let me help. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. It was not trust, not quite, but it was the first tentative step in that direction. Franklin walked her back to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, carrying her forgotten packages. He spoke with the widow privately for several minutes, while Violet waited in the kitchen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When he emerged, his expression was determined. Mrs. Patterson has agreed to tell anyone who asks that you left town yesterday, headed east to Minneapolis, he said. If Marcus comes around, she will send word to the ranch immediately, and we will deal with him. In the meantime, I want you to feel safe here. No one will hurt you, Violet. I give you my word. Over the following days, Violet began to notice the protective net Franklin had quietly woven around her. The sheriff, a grizzled former Texas Ranger named Tom Monroe, started making more frequent patrols past the boarding house. The shopkeepers whom Franklin did business with began nodding to Violet in greeting when she made her rounds, their expressions friendly and watchful in equal measure. Franklin himself stopped by each evening after finishing his work at the ranch, always with some pretext, dropping off fresh beef for Mrs. Patterson, delivering a letter, asking after something trivial. He never stayed long or pressed for more than Violet was willing to give, but his presence became a constant in her days, something she found herself looking forward to despite her lingering fears. One evening, he brought his guitar and asked if he might play for Mrs. Patterson and her boarders. They gathered in the front parlor as the August sun set in shades of orange and red, and Franklin's fingers moved over the strings with surprising grace. He played old ballads and folk songs, his voice a warm baritone that wrapped around the words like honey. Violet sat in a corner, pretending to work on her mending, but her hands had gone still as she listened. The music ached with beauty, speaking of loss and hope in equal measure. When Franklin's eyes met hers across the room during a particularly poignant verse, she felt that crack in her heart widen just a little more. After the music ended and the other boarders had drifted off to their rooms, Franklin lingered on the porch. Violet found herself drawn outside, settling into one of the wooden chairs while he leaned against the railing. "My mother taught me to play," he said, answering her unspoken question. "She said music was good for the soul, that it could heal things words could not reach." He turned to look at her, his expression open. "Do you play any instrument?" Violet shook her head. "My mother tried to teach me piano when I was young, before she passed. I never had the patience for it." "What was she like? Your mother?" It had been years since anyone had asked about her family. Marcus had never cared to know about her life before him, had in fact seemed to prefer that she have no history, no identity separate from being his wife. Violet found the words coming slowly at first, then more easily as Franklin listened with genuine interest. She told him about her mother's love of gardening, about the small house in Bismarck where Violet had grown up, about her father who had died in a mining accident when she was 16. She talked about the loneliness that had followed, about taking work as a seamstress to support herself, about meeting Marcus and thinking he was the answer to her isolation. "He was charming at first," she said quietly, staring out at the darkening street. "Attentive and generous. He made me feel special, like I was the most important person in the world. I was too young and too desperate for connection to see the warning signs. By the time I understood what he really was, I was already trapped." "How long were you married?" Franklin asked. "4 years, each one worse than the last." Violet wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm evening. "He would apologize after each incident, swear it would never happen again, and I would believe him because I wanted so badly for it to be true. But it was always the same pattern, the charm, then the anger, then the violence, then the apologies, over and over until I could not remember who I had been before him." Franklin was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with controlled anger. "He had no right to do that to you. No man has the right to treat a woman that way." "I know that now," Violet said. "But knowing and believing are different things. Part of me still expects punishment for having left, still feels like I deserve whatever consequences come." She looked at Franklin, needing him to understand. "That is why I cannot promise you anything. I am too broken, Franklin, too damaged by what happened. I am not sure I remember how to be the person I was before Marcus, or if that person even exists anymore." Franklin moved from the railing to crouch in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "You are not broken, Violet. You are bent, maybe, bruised, but not broken. I can see it in you, the strength that got you through those 4 years, and the courage that made you finally leave. That is not the mark of a broken woman." He reached out slowly and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather light. "And I am not asking for promises. I am only asking that you let yourself heal and that you let me be here while you do. The rest we can figure out as we go." Violet felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were not entirely from grief. There was something else mixed in, something fragile and tentative that might have been hope. The next 2 weeks passed without incident, and Violet began to breathe a little easier. The news of Marcus searching for her seemed to have been old information, and no one else reported seeing him in the area. Violet allowed herself to settle into her life in Fargo, to find a rhythm that felt almost normal. She continued her work for Mrs. Patterson, but also began taking on sewing projects for some of the town's women, finding that her old skills with a needle had not entirely left her. The work was satisfying in a way that went beyond mere survival. Creating something beautiful from simple cloth reminded her that not everything had to be about enduring. Sometimes life could be about building, too. Franklin became a fixture in her daily existence, so gradually that she hardly noticed the transition. He would appear with small gifts: a book he thought she might enjoy, a jar of honey from the ranch, wildflowers picked from the prairie. He asked her opinion on things, listened when she spoke, and never once made her feel foolish or small. He told her stories about the ranch, about the cattle drives he had been on as a younger man, about the vast, wild beauty of the Dakota Territory. His love for the land was evident in every word, and Violet found herself seeing the world through his eyes, noticing the sweep of the prairie grass in the wind and the impossible size of the sky at sunset. One afternoon, he invited her to visit the Gates Ranch. "My father has been asking to meet you," he explained, "and I thought you might enjoy seeing something beyond the town. The ranch is only an hour's ride, and I promise to have you back before dark." Violet hesitated, old fears rising up. Leaving town felt dangerous, like straying too far from whatever safety she had built. But Franklin's steady presence had begun to work its way under her defenses, and she found herself wanting to trust him, to see this place that meant so much to him. "All right," she agreed, "but I have never been much of a rider." Franklin grinned. "Then it is a good thing I brought the wagon." They left early on a Sunday morning when Violet's duties at the boarding house were lightest. The wagon was comfortable with a padded bench seat and a team of well-trained horses. Franklin drove with easy competence, one hand loose on the reins, while he pointed out landmarks along the way. The land stretched out in all directions, rolling prairie broken by the occasional stand of cottonwood trees or the glint of a creek. Violet had lived in the Dakota Territory her whole life, but had rarely ventured beyond the towns. Seeing it like this, vast and untamed, she understood why Franklin spoke of it with such reverence. The Gates Ranch sat in a shallow valley where a good-sized creek provided year-round water. The house was large and well-built, made of logs chinked with white plaster, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Corrals and outbuildings spread out behind it, and Violet could see cattle grazing in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. It looked prosperous and well cared for, the kind of place that spoke of generations of hard work and planning. Franklin's father, William Gates, came out to meet them. He was in his early 50s, weathered by sun and wind, with Franklin's kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Miss Zimmerman," he said warmly, "my son has told me a great deal about you. Welcome to our home." Inside, the house was comfortable and masculine, with sturdy furniture and Navajo rugs on the wooden floors. A woman's touch was evident in small ways: embroidered cushions, carefully arranged wildflowers in a vase, and Franklin explained that a widow from town came twice a week to clean and cook for them. They sat in the main room, and William served coffee, while Franklin sliced bread and cheese for a light meal. "Franklin says you are from Bismarck originally," William said, settling into a chair across from Violet. "That is good country down there. What brought you north?" Violet glanced at Franklin, uncertain how much his father knew. Franklin gave a small nod, as if to say it was her choice what to share. "I needed a fresh start," she said carefully. "Sometimes staying in a place holds you back from becoming who you are meant to be." William studied her for a moment, his gaze shrewd but not unkind. "That is wise thinking for someone so young. Most people spend their whole lives in one place, for good or ill, never testing themselves against something new." He sipped his coffee. "I came to the Dakota Territory in 1855 when there was barely anything here but grass and sky and the Sioux. Lost more than I care to count in those early years cattle, friends, nearly my life a time or two. But I stayed because this land gets under your skin. It makes you earn every good thing, but it also makes you appreciate what you have. Franklin leaned forward, his forearms on his knees. Pa, I was thinking of showing Violet the creek overlook. We would be back before supper. William's eyes moved between them, and Violet saw understanding and approval there. That is a fine idea. Mind the path down, though. The rains last week made it slippery in places. They left the house and walked toward the creek, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of cottonwood and willow. The air was cooler here, shaded in green, and Violet could hear the musical sound of water over stones. Franklin led her up a small rise to a rocky outcropping that overlooked the creek valley. From this vantage point, she could see the ranch spread out below and the prairie rolling away to the horizon. I come here when I need to think, Franklin said, settling onto a flat rock and gesturing for her to join him. There is something about seeing everything from up high that makes problems seem smaller, more manageable. Violet sat beside him, careful to leave space between them, though she was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth of him in the cool shade. It is beautiful here. I can see why you love it. It is more than beautiful, Franklin said, his gaze on the distant horizon. It is possibility. When I look out at this land, I see everything that could be built, all the good that could be done. Pa started with nothing but determination and a small herd. Now we have something real, something lasting. He turned to look at her, his expression serious. I want to build something like that with someone. Not just a ranch, but a life, a partnership, children to pass it all on to teach them the things Pa taught me. Violet's heart clenched. She heard the unspoken question in his words, the gentle invitation. Franklin, I cannot promise I am ready for that. I do not know if I will ever be ready. I know, he said quietly, and I am not asking you to decide anything today. I am only telling you what I want, what I hope for. When you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will be here. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun track across the sky. Violet felt something shifting inside her, some long frozen part of her beginning to thaw. It was painful, like blood rushing back into a numb limb, but it was also proof that she was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than fear and shame. On the ride back to Fargo that evening, with the sunset painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange, Violet made a decision. She would stop merely surviving and start trying to live again. She would let herself believe that good men existed, that she deserved kindness, that her past mistakes did not have to define her future. It would not be easy, and there would be setbacks, but for the first time since she could remember, she wanted to try. Franklin must have sensed the change in her because he reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. They rode the rest of the way like that, hands joined, not speaking but not needing to. Some things were better communicated in silence. The last week of August brought news that shattered Violet's fragile peace. She was hanging laundry in the early morning coolness when Mrs. Patterson came rushing out, her face pale with worry. "Violet, you need to come inside immediately. The sheriff is here." Violet's blood turned to ice. She dropped the shirt she had been pinning and followed Mrs. Patterson into the house, her mind racing through terrible possibilities. Sheriff Monroe stood in the front parlor, his hat in his hands, his expression grave. "Miss Zimmerman," he said without preamble, "I wanted to warn you in person. A man matching the description Franklin Gates gave me was seen at the saloon last night. He was asking about you using your name, called himself Marcus Zimmerman, and said he was looking for his wife." The room tilted. Violet grasped the back of a chair to steady herself. "Is he still in town?" "He left the saloon around midnight. No one has seen him since, but I have men watching the roads and the boarding house. If he is smart, he will move on. But if he comes around here, we will be ready for him." "He will not give up," Violet said, her voice hollow. You do not know him. He does not let go. Then he will learn what happens to men who threaten women under my protection, Monroe said firmly. I have sent word to the Gates Ranch. Franklin is riding in this morning. Until we know for certain that Zimmerman has left the area, I want you to stay indoors and keep away from the windows. The next several hours were among the longest of Violet's life. She tried to keep busy with her usual work, but her hands shook so badly she could barely thread a needle. Mrs. Patterson kept up a steady stream of reassuring conversation, but Violet could see the worry in the older woman's eyes. Every sound from the street outside made her jump, expecting at any moment to hear Marcus's voice, to feel his hand on her arm, dragging her back to a life she had barely escaped. Franklin arrived just before noon, bursting through the door with barely contained urgency. He took one look at Violet's pale face and crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms. She went stiff with surprise, then melted against him, letting herself take comfort from his solid presence. I am here, he murmured into her hair. You are safe. I promise you, Violet, he will not touch you. She pulled back enough to look up at him. He will not stop, Franklin. Even if he leaves Fargo, he will keep looking. I will never be free of him. Then we will deal with that, Franklin said firmly. But right now, I want you to pack a bag. You are coming to the ranch until this is resolved. I cannot leave Mrs. Patterson short-handed. I will manage just fine, Mrs. Patterson interrupted. Franklin is right. You will be safer at the ranch with more people around to watch out for you. Go on now. Get your things. Violet wanted to argue, but the relief of escaping the town, of putting distance between herself and Marcus, was overwhelming. She packed quickly, taking only what she could fit in her carpet bag. Within an hour, she was seated beside Franklin in his wagon, leaving Fargo behind as they headed for the ranch. William Gates welcomed her without question, showing her to a guest room on the 2nd floor with windows that overlooked the front approach to the house. You will be safe here, he said simply. We take care of our own, and Franklin has made it clear that includes you. That night at supper, with Franklin and William and 3 ranch hands gathered around the long table, Violet finally told the whole story. She explained about Marcus's violence, about the murder she had witnessed, about the lies she had told to protect him. The words tumbled out in a rush, years of shame and guilt pouring forth. When she finished, she could not bring herself to look at any of them, certain she would see condemnation or disgust. Instead, Franklin reached across the table and took her hand. Thank you for trusting us with that. It could not have been easy to relive. The man who was killed, William said carefully. What was his name? James Holbrook, Violet whispered. He was a traveling merchant from St. Paul. He had a wife named Catherine and 3 children. William exchanged a glance with one of the ranch hands, a lean, quiet man named Thomas. Holbrook. I knew that name sounded familiar. There was a story in the newspaper about it. They said the killing was ruled self-defense, but there was some question about it. It was not self-defense, Violet said, her voice breaking. Marcus shot him in cold blood because he had lost money at cards and wanted to take it back. I should have told the truth. That family deserved justice, and I was too much of a coward to give it to them. You were a victim too, Franklin said firmly, squeezing her hand. And you are making things right now by finally telling the truth. We will write to the authorities in Bismarck, explain what really happened. It may be too late to change the verdict, but at least the truth will be on record. Marcus will come after me even harder if I do that, Violet said, fear making her voice shake. Then he will have to go through all of us, William said, his tone leaving no room for argument. We stand together here, Miss Zimmerman. That is what it means to be part of this family. Violet felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but this time they were not entirely from fear. The acceptance, the unwavering support, was more than she had dared to hope for. For the first time in years, she felt like maybe she was not facing the world alone. The next 3 days passed in tense anticipation. Sheriff Monroe sent word that Marcus had been spotted on the roads north of Fargo, but had not returned to town. Violet tried to settle into the rhythm of ranch life, helping with cooking and mending to earn her keep, but anxiety gnawed at her constantly. She slept poorly, starting awake at every sound, her dreams haunted by Marcus's face twisted with rage. Franklin stayed close, finding excuses to be near the house rather than out on the range. He taught her to play simple songs on his guitar, the music a balm to her frayed nerves. He took her riding on a gentle mare, showing her the boundaries of the ranch and the hidden beauty of the prairie. Slowly, despite her fear, Violet found herself falling into something she had thought lost forever. She was falling in love. It was different from what she had felt for Marcus. There was no desperate neediness, no clinging to someone because she feared being alone. What she felt for Franklin was built on steadier ground: respect, trust, genuine affection. She loved the way he treated his father and the ranch hands with equal dignity, the way he was gentle with the animals, the way he looked at her as though she were something precious. She loved his quiet strength, his steady faith that things would work out, his determination to protect her without making her feel weak. On the fourth evening, as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Violet finally gave voice to what she had been feeling. "Franklin," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, his expression open and patient. "I am listening. I have been so afraid for so long that I forgot what it felt like to want something beyond mere survival. But being here with you, being part of this place and this life, I have started to remember." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I am not sure I am ready for everything you spoke about: the partnership, the children, the future. But I want to try. If you are willing to be patient with me, to let me heal at my own pace, then I would like to try building something with you." Franklin's smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. He reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips to brush a kiss across her knuckles. "I would wait a lifetime if that was what you needed, Violet. There is no rush. We have all the time in the world to figure out what comes next." They sat together in the growing darkness, hands joined, and Violet felt something she had not experienced in years settle into her chest: contentment. She was not naive enough to think all her problems were solved, that Marcus would simply disappear, or that her trauma would heal overnight. But for the first time, she could see a path forward, a future that held more than just fear and regret. The confrontation came 5 days after Violet had arrived at the ranch. She was in the kitchen helping prepare the noon meal when Thomas came running from the barn, shouting for Franklin and William. Violet's heart seized as she heard the words. "Rider coming in fast from the north, armed and angry looking." Franklin appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face set in grim lines. "Violet, I need you to go upstairs and stay away from the windows. Pa, get the rifles." "No," Violet said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "If it is Marcus, hiding will not solve anything. He will not leave until he gets what he came for. Let me talk to him." "Absolutely not," Franklin said flatly. "You are not going anywhere near that man." "He is my husband," Violet said, and the word tasted like ash in her mouth. "Legally, I am still bound to him. If I do not face him now, if I do not make it clear that I will not go back, this will never end. He will keep coming." William stepped forward, a rifle cradled in his arms. "The lady has a point, son. Sometimes you have to face a problem head on before you can put it behind you. But," he added, fixing Violet with a stern look, "you will not face him alone. We will be right there with you." Franklin looked like he wanted to argue, but he must have seen the determination in Violet's eyes. He nodded reluctantly. "All right, but at the first sign of trouble, you get behind me." "Understood." They gathered on the front porch, a united front. William and Franklin with rifles, Thomas and the other two ranch hands flanking them with pistols on their hips. Violet stood slightly behind Franklin, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. In the distance, a single rider approached at a gallop, dust rising in his wake. As he drew closer, Violet's worst fears were confirmed. Even from a distance, she recognized Marcus's lean build, the particular way he sat a horse. He reined in hard at the edge of the yard, his mount dancing nervously. For a moment, everyone stood frozen in a terrible tableau. Then Marcus's voice rang out, sharp and familiar and filled with barely controlled rage. "Violet, get out here now. We are going home." Violet stepped forward, ignoring Franklin's quiet protest. She moved to the edge of the porch, her hands gripping the railing to keep them from shaking. "I am not going anywhere with you, Marcus. We are finished." Marcus dismounted in one fluid motion, stalking toward the porch. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes wild. He looked thinner than she remembered, harder, as though the past months had honed away anything soft in him. "You do not get to decide that. You are my wife. You will come home, and we will forget this foolishness." "No," Violet said, and the word came out stronger than she felt. "I will never go back to you. What we had was not a marriage. It was a prison, and I have escaped." Marcus's face twisted with fury. "You ungrateful bitch! I gave you everything. A home, a name, security. And this is how you repay me? By running off and making me look like a fool? You made yourself look like a fool." Violet shot back, anger finally overriding her fear. "You killed an innocent man, Marcus. You murdered James Holbrook in cold blood, and you made me lie to cover for you. I have to live with that guilt for the rest of my life, but I will not enable your violence anymore." "That bastard got what he deserved," Marcus snarled. "And you will keep your mouth shut about it if you know what is good for you." Franklin stepped forward, placing himself between Marcus and Violet. "She does not have to do anything you say anymore. You heard her. The marriage is over. Now get off this property before we remove you forcibly." Marcus's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and suddenly every man on the porch had a weapon aimed at him. He froze, eyes darting from one grim face to another, calculating his odds. "You think you can keep her?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think she is worth all this trouble? She is broken goods, Cowboy. Damaged. I made sure of that." "You are wrong," Franklin said, his voice cold as winter steel. "The only broken thing here is you. Now you have two choices: ride away and never come back, or we turn you over to the sheriff and let him know about that murder in Bismarck. I am sure they would be very interested to hear about how you coerced your wife into lying for you." Marcus's face went pale, then florid with rage. "You would not dare. Try me," Franklin said flatly. For a long moment, the tension stretched taut as a wire. Violet held her breath, waiting for the violence she knew Marcus was capable of. But something in Franklin's unwavering stance, or perhaps the sight of 5 armed men united against him, seemed to finally penetrate Marcus's anger. He took a step back, then another. "This is not over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "She is still my wife." "Not for long," Williams said calmly. "We have already contacted a lawyer about annulment proceedings. On the grounds of domestic violence and coercion, it should not be hard to get. You will be served papers within the month." Marcus looked at Violet one last time, and in his eyes she saw impotent rage and something else, the dawning realization that he had lost. Whatever power he had once held over her was broken, shattered beyond repair. "You will regret this," he said, but he was already backing toward his horse. "You will come crawling back, and I will not be there." "Good," Violet said softly. "That is exactly what I am hoping for." Marcus mounted and wheeled his horse around, galloping away without another word. They watched until he was nothing more than a distant speck on the horizon, and even then no one lowered their weapons. It was Thomas who finally spoke. "Should we follow him? Make sure he leaves the territory?" "No need," William said. "He is a coward. Bullies always are once someone stands up to them. He will not be back." Violet's legs gave out. She would have collapsed if Franklin had not caught her, sweeping her up into his arms and carrying her inside. He settled her on the sofa in the front room, kneeling beside her while William brought water. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, the aftermath of adrenaline and years of pent-up fear finally releasing all at once. "You were so brave," Franklin murmured, smoothing hair back from her face. "God, Violet, I have never seen anything like that." You faced him down. "I did not feel brave," she admitted, her voice wobbling. "I felt terrified." "That is what makes it bravery," William said gruffly, patting her shoulder. "Doing what needs doing, even when you are scared to death." The shaking gradually subsided, leaving Violet exhausted but oddly lighter, as though some enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She looked up at Franklin, at his worried, loving expression, and felt her heart swell with gratitude and affection so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing with me, for believing me, for everything." Franklin cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "There is nowhere else I would rather be than beside you. Today, tomorrow, and every day after, if you will have me." She kissed him then, a soft press of lips that tasted of salt from her tears and hope for the future. It was a tentative kiss, unpracticed and sweet, and when they broke apart, Franklin was smiling like she had just given him the sun and moon wrapped in ribbon. "I will take that as a yes," he said, and Violet laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine joy. The next weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings and new beginnings. True to William's word, annulment papers were filed, citing Marcus's documented violence and coercion. Sheriff Monroe added his testimony about the suspicious circumstances surrounding James Holbrook's death, and an investigation was reopened in Bismarck. Marcus, faced with mounting evidence and the possibility of a murder trial, did not contest the annulment. By the end of September, Violet received notification that her marriage had been legally dissolved. She was free. The news should have brought relief, and it did, but it also brought a strange grief, not for Marcus or the marriage, but for the 4 years of her life that had been lost to fear and survival. Violet mourned the young woman she had been before, the dreams she had set aside, the trust that had been shattered. Franklin held her through the tears, never trying to fix or minimize her feelings, just offering his steady presence as an anchor. "Healing is not a straight line," he told her one evening as they sat by the creek. Autumn had begun to touch the prairie, painting the grass in shades of amber and rust. "Some days will be harder than others, but you do not have to do it alone anymore." Violet leaned into his shoulder, watching the water flow past. "I want to write to Catherine Holbrook," she said quietly. "James's widow. I want to tell her the truth about what happened and apologize for my part in denying her justice." "That is a good idea," Franklin agreed. "It will not change the past, but it might bring her some peace to know the truth is finally acknowledged." The letter took Violet 3 days to write. She drafted and redrafted, trying to find words adequate to express her remorse and guilt. In the end, she settled on simple honesty, explaining what she had witnessed, why she had lied, and how deeply she regretted the pain her silence had caused. She included information about the reopened investigation and her hope that Catherine and her children might finally receive some measure of justice. Mailing the letter felt like setting down a burden she had carried for too long. Catherine's response came 6 weeks later, forwarded to the ranch from Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Violet opened it with shaking hands, expecting anger or condemnation. Instead, she found something unexpected: forgiveness. "Dear Mrs. Zimmerman," the letter began, and Violet noted the deliberate use of her former married name. "Your letter reached me yesterday, and I have read it many times since, trying to understand my feelings. I will not lie and say I am not angry about the lies told during the trial, because I am. My children and I have suffered greatly because justice was denied. However, I also recognize that you were a victim of your husband's violence and that fear drove your actions. I hope you can find peace in your new life, free from the man who hurt us both in different ways. Thank you for finally telling the truth. It means more than you might realize. Catherine Holbrook. Violet wept over the letter, Franklin's arms around her as she read it aloud. The forgiveness, unearned and freely given, felt like grace, like a door opening onto a future where she might finally forgive herself. As autumn deepened into winter, Violet's life at the Gates Ranch settled into a comfortable pattern. She took over much of the cooking and household management, freeing up William to focus on the cattle operation. She learned to ride properly, venturing out with Franklin to check fence lines and move cattle to winter pasture. The physical work was demanding but satisfying, and she discovered a strength in herself she had not known existed. The prairie, which had once seemed empty and intimidating, revealed itself as a place of harsh beauty and surprising resilience. She felt a kinship with it, both of them tested by hardship but enduring. Franklin courted her properly, with a patience and respect that made her love him more with each passing day. He never pressured her for more than she was ready to give, content to let their relationship develop at her pace. They took long rides together, talking about everything and nothing. He taught her to shoot, patiently correcting her stance until she could hit a target more often than not. She taught him to cook beyond the basics, and they spent evenings in the kitchen experimenting with recipes while William pretended to read his newspaper but smiled at their laughter. It was on a cold December evening, with the first real snow of winter falling soft and silent outside, that Franklin asked her to marry him. They were alone in the front room, the fire crackling warmly, William having diplomatically excused himself to bed early. Franklin took her hands, his expression serious and tender. "Violet Zimmerman," he said, her name a caress on his lips. "I know we have not known each other long, not even half a year, and I know you have been through more than any person should have to endure, but I love you. I love your strength and your courage and the way you refuse to let your past define your future. I love the sound of your laugh and the way you hum while you cook and the fierce concentration on your face when you are sewing. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy, if you will let me. Will you marry me?" Violet's heart felt too large for her chest, swelling with emotion so powerful it robbed her of breath. She looked at this good man, this unexpected blessing, and knew her answer with absolute certainty. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, Franklin, I will marry you." His whoop of joy brought William running from his room, pretending concern until he saw their joined hands and matching smiles. Then he wrapped them both in a fierce hug, his gruff voice thick with emotion as he welcomed Violet officially into the family. They married in January of 1883 in a simple ceremony at the Fargo church with Sheriff Monroe and Mrs. Patterson as witnesses. Violet wore a dress she had sewn herself from dove gray wool, practical for the cold weather, but trimmed with delicate white lace at the collar and cuffs. Franklin wore his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his eyes full of love and promise as he spoke his vows. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Franklin kissed her with such tenderness that Violet felt tears slip down her cheeks. The wedding supper was held at the ranch, with the Hands and several friends from town in attendance. There was music and dancing, laughter and toasts to the happy couple. Violet, watching Franklin spin an older woman around the floor with gentle courtesy, felt a contentment so profound it frightened her. She had not known she could be this happy, had not believed such simple, honest joy was possible for someone like her. "You deserve this," Mrs. Patterson said, appearing at her elbow with a knowing smile. "You deserve every bit of happiness that comes your way. Do not ever let yourself believe otherwise." "I am trying," Violet admitted. "Some days are easier than others. That is all any of us can do," the older woman said. "Try and keep trying, even when it is hard. That is what makes a marriage work and a life worth living." The first year of marriage was not without its challenges. Violet still had nightmares sometimes, waking, gasping, and disoriented, her mind convinced she was back in Bismarck, with Marcus's hands around her throat. Franklin learned to wake her gently, to hold her until the panic passed, never making her feel weak or broken for the lingering trauma. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, the endless cycle of work demanded by the land and the animals. There were hard lessons, like the winter storm that killed a dozen cattle despite their best efforts, and small triumphs, like the first meal she cooked entirely on her own that everyone declared was better than anything they had tasted. She and Franklin built a partnership that went beyond the traditional roles of husband and wife. He valued her opinions and sought her input on ranch decisions. She took charge of the household accounts and proved to have a head for figures that improved their profit margins. They worked together, played together, and gradually learned each other's bodies with the tentative joy of two people who had both known the wrong kind of touch and were discovering the right kind for the first time. Spring brought news that Marcus had been formally charged with the murder of James Holbrook. New witnesses had come forward, people who had been at the saloon that night and had been too afraid to speak up during the original trial. Marcus was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. Violet received the news with mixed feelings, relief warring with a strange sort of pity for the man who had wasted his life on anger and violence. She wrote to Catherine Holbrook to share the outcome and received a brief reply expressing satisfaction that justice had finally been served. That same spring, Violet discovered she was pregnant. The realization brought a complicated mix of joy and terror. She had thought she wanted children, had dreamed of them during the long, lonely nights of her first marriage when a child might have offered someone to love and be loved by. But now, faced with the reality, she was overwhelmed by doubt. What if she was a terrible mother? What if her past had damaged her too much to raise a child properly? What if she passed on her brokenness? Franklin found her crying in the barn one afternoon, curled up in the hayloft where she had gone to be alone with her spiraling thoughts. He climbed up to sit beside her, patient and quiet, until she could find words for her fear. "I do not know how to do this," she confessed. "I do not know how to be someone's mother. What if I fail?" "Then you will do what every parent does," Franklin said gently. "You will try again. You will make mistakes, and you will learn from them, and you will love this child with everything you have. That is all anyone can do." He took her hand, placing it against his chest where she could feel the steady thump of his heart. "You are the strongest person I know, Violet. You survived things that would have broken most people. If you can do that, you can certainly handle one small baby." "Or babies," Violet said with a watery laugh. "The midwife says she thinks it might be twins. It runs in my family." Franklin's eyes went wide, then a grin spread across his face so bright it rivaled the sun. "Twins? Well then, I suppose we will just have to love twice as hard." He was right, of course. When their sons were born in late October, two healthy, squalling boys with Franklin's dark hair and Violet's delicate features, she felt her heart crack open in a way she had not known was possible. They named the firstborn Henry William, after Franklin's father and mother's father, and the second Thomas Franklin, after the ranch hand who had been so staunchly protective of Violet and in honor of his father. Holding them, one cradled in each arm, Violet understood for the first time that love did not have limits. Her capacity for it was not diminished by what she had survived. If anything, it had grown stronger, tempered by hardship into something that could weather any storm. The boys were 6 months old when Violet received a letter that changed something fundamental in how she saw herself. It came from a women's aid society in Minneapolis, an organization that helped women escape abusive marriages. The founder, a woman named Elizabeth Morris, had read about Violet's testimony in the Holbrook case and wanted to know if Violet would be willing to share her story more widely. "There are so many women trapped in situations like you were," Elizabeth wrote. "Women who believe they have no options, nowhere to turn. Your story could give them hope, show them that escape is possible, and that there can be life after abuse. Would you consider writing about your experiences? We would publish it in our newsletter, which reaches women across the territory. Violet showed the letter to Franklin over supper that evening, uncertain how he would feel about her sharing such private pain publicly. He read it carefully, then set it down and took her hand. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I think I want to say yes," Violet admitted. "If my story could help even one woman find the courage to leave, then maybe some good could come from what I went through. Maybe it would not all have been for nothing." "Then you should do it," Franklin said firmly. "I am proud of you, Violet, for surviving, for healing, and now for being brave enough to help others do the same." She wrote the article over the course of several weeks, pouring out the truth of her marriage to Marcus in unflinching detail. She described the escalating violence, the isolation, the way her sense of self had been systematically dismantled. She wrote about the murder and her complicity, about the guilt and shame that had nearly destroyed her. But she also wrote about escape, about finding help, about the long, difficult process of healing. She ended with a message to other women who might be reading: "You are not alone. You are not crazy. You are not to blame. And most importantly, there is hope. If I could find my way out, so can you." The response was overwhelming. Elizabeth Morris reported that the newsletter issue featuring Violet's story had their highest readership ever. Letters poured in from women across the territory and beyond, some sharing their own stories, others simply thanking Violet for giving voice to experiences they had thought were theirs alone to bear. A few letters came from men who said reading Violet's words had opened their eyes to the reality of abuse and made them more aware of warning signs in their own communities. One letter in particular moved Violet to tears. It was from a young woman in Montana who wrote, "I read your story, and for the first time, I believed it was possible to leave. You survived, and you found happiness again. If you could do it, maybe I can too. I have made plans. I have saved money in secret. Next month, when my husband goes on his cattle drive, I am taking my children and running. Thank you for showing me it is possible." Violet kept that letter in a drawer beside her bed, reading it whenever the nightmares returned or the old shame tried to reassert itself. She had turned her suffering into something that mattered, something that helped others. There was power in that, a reclaiming of agency that felt like the final piece of her healing falling into place. The years that followed brought their share of joys and sorrows, as all lives do. William Gates passed away peacefully in his sleep when the twins were 3, and Franklin grieved deeply for the father who had shaped him into the man he had become. They held a memorial service at the ranch, with people coming from across the territory to pay their respects to a man who had been universally respected and loved. Violet stood beside her husband as he delivered the eulogy, her hand in his, lending him her strength as he had so often lent her his. They expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land when a neighboring family decided to move back east. The cattle operation grew prosperous, and they hired more hands to help with the work. Violet took over the household completely, managing a staff of 2 women who helped with cooking and cleaning. She continued to write for the Women's Aid Society, contributing articles and advice several times a year. The work gave her a sense of purpose beyond the domestic sphere, a way to use her experience to create positive change. When the twins were 5, Violet found herself pregnant again. This time there was no fear, only excited anticipation. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1889, a tiny thing with Violet's dark eyes and Franklin's determined chin. They named her Sarah Grace, and she was immediately adored by her big brothers, who took their role as protectors with endearing seriousness. Life settled into a pattern that felt like the reward for all the hard years that had come before. Violet would rise before dawn to prepare breakfast for the family and hands, then spend her mornings managing the household while the twins attended the small school that had been established in Fargo. Afternoons were for Sarah, for teaching her letters and numbers, for walks to the creek where they would collect interesting stones and watch the play of light on water. Evenings belonged to Franklin, to sitting together on the porch as the sun set, talking about the day's events or simply enjoying the companionable silence of two people who knew each other bone deep. The twins grew into sturdy, hardworking boys who loved the ranch as much as their father did. Henry was quiet and thoughtful, with a gift for handling horses that reminded everyone of his grandfather. Thomas was more outgoing, always ready with a joke or a plan for some adventure. Sarah, when she was old enough, proved to have inherited Violet's skill with a needle and her mother's fierce independence. She declared at 7 that she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, and Violet and Franklin encouraged her, even though such aspirations were unusual for girls. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Franklin took Violet back to the creek overlook where he had first told her about his dreams for the future. They stood looking out over land that was now fully theirs, at the house they had expanded and improved, at the life they had built together from the broken pieces of Violet's past. "Do you remember what I told you here?" Franklin asked, his arm around her waist. "You said you wanted to build something lasting with someone," Violet recalled. "A partnership, a family, a legacy to pass on." "We did it," Franklin said softly. "We built something real, something good, and it is more than I ever dreamed possible." Violet leaned into her husband's embrace, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. She thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived in Fargo, hollow and hopeless, convinced that she was too damaged to ever deserve happiness. She thought about the night she had confirmed Marcus's lie, believing she had no other choice. She thought about all the small, brave decisions that had led her from that darkness into this light. The choice to leave, to accept help, to trust again, to risk loving and being loved. "I could not have done it without you," she said, tilting her head up to look at Franklin. "You showed me that hope was still possible when I had lost all faith in it. You taught me that not all men are cruel, that love does not have to hurt. You gave me back myself." Franklin kissed her forehead tenderly. "You did that yourself, Violet. I just held the door open. You were the one brave enough to walk through it." They stood together as the stars began to emerge, two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the wreckage of the past. Below them, the ranch house glowed with warm light, and Violet could hear the distant sound of her children's laughter drifting up on the evening breeze. She had lost everything once, her innocence, her sense of self, her belief in goodness. But she had found it all again in this place, with this man, in this life they had created together. The wild, beautiful Dakota prairie had tested her and tempered her and ultimately given her a home. She had learned that surviving was not enough. She had learned to live, truly live, with joy and purpose and love. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were less frequent now, their power diminished by the weight of all the good days that had accumulated. When she woke gasping in the dark, Franklin was there, solid and real, reminding her that she was safe, that she was loved, that the past could not hurt her anymore. And in the morning, there would be coffee to make and children to feed and a ranch to run and 100 small, ordinary miracles that made up a life worth living. Years continued to pass, each one adding another layer to the foundation they had built. The twins graduated from the Fargo school and began taking on more responsibility at the ranch, learning the business from their father with the intention of one day running it themselves. Sarah proved to be brilliant, her determination to become a doctor never wavering despite the obstacles society placed in front of women with such ambitions. When she turned 16, Franklin and Violet sent her to St. Paul to attend a preparatory school that would prepare her for medical college. It was hard to let her go, but they knew that clipping her wings would betray everything they believed about what women could achieve. Violet continued her work with the Women's Aid Society, which had grown from a single newsletter into a network of safe houses and resources spanning multiple territories. She traveled occasionally, giving talks at churches and civic organizations about the realities of domestic violence and the need for legal protections for women. It was difficult work, emotionally draining, but it felt vital. Every woman she helped, every mind she changed, felt like a small victory against the darkness that had once consumed her own life. On a warm summer evening in 1895, as Violet and Franklin sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done countless times before, a writer approached the house. He was young, barely out of boyhood, and he carried a telegram. Franklin accepted it with thanks and a coin, then turned it over in his hands, frowning. "It is from Sarah," he said, opening the envelope. He read quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to surprise to pure joy. "She has been accepted to the Women's Medical College in Pennsylvania. She starts in the fall." Violet's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing immediately to her eyes. "Oh, Franklin, she did it. Our little girl did it." They held each other and cried, overwhelmed by pride and the bittersweet knowledge that their daughter was truly grown now, ready to make her own mark on the world. Later, after they had composed themselves and shared the news with Henry and Thomas, who whooped and hollered with their own excitement, Violet found herself back on the porch, looking out at the darkening prairie. She thought about the girl she had been at 19, marrying Marcus in a desperate bid to escape loneliness. She thought about how small her world had been then, how limited her dreams. If someone had told that girl that one day she would have a daughter going to medical college, that she would own a prosperous ranch with a man who loved her with unwavering devotion, that she would travel the territory speaking to crowds about women's rights and safety, she would not have believed it possible. But here she was, living proof that people could change, that circumstances could improve, that hope was not just a pretty word, but a tangible force that could reshape lives. She had lost everything once, but she had rebuilt it all and more. She had taken the broken pieces of her past and forged them into something stronger, something that could weather any storm. Franklin came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers automatically. "What are you thinking about?" "How far we have come," Violet said softly. "How different everything is from what I thought my life would be." "Better or worse?" Franklin asked, though his tone suggested he knew the answer. "Better," Violet said without hesitation. "So much better than I ever dreamed possible. You gave me that, Franklin. You and this land and this life we have built. You showed me that hope was not just possible. It was real and within reach if I was brave enough to grasp it." "We gave each other that," Franklin corrected gently. "Your courage inspired me as much as my support helped you. That is what partnership means, Violet. We make each other stronger." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other when both had needed saving in different ways. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of wild roses and sage. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the sound was not lonely but simply part of the vast symphony of life that played out endlessly on these plains. The house behind them glowed with lamplight, and Violet could see through the windows as Henry and Thomas moved about, preparing for another early morning of ranch work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to build upon the foundation they had laid. But tonight, standing here with Franklin's hand in hers and the stars emerging overhead, Violet felt a peace so complete it seemed to encompass everything she had ever been and everything she had become. She had learned that healing was not a destination, but a journey, one that required daily recommitment. She had learned that love, real love, was built on respect and trust and the willingness to support each other through darkness and light. She had learned that her past did not define her future unless she let it, that she had the power to choose who she wanted to be and what kind of life she wanted to live. Most importantly, she had learned that hope was not foolish or naive. It was essential, the thing that kept people moving forward, even when the path seemed impossible. Franklin had shown her that hope was still possible when she had lost all faith, and together they had built a life that proved hope right every single day. As the years continued to unfold, that hope never dimmed. Sarah graduated from medical college and returned west to practice in Fargo, becoming the first female doctor in the Dakota Territory. and a source of immeasurable pride for her parents. The twins eventually took over the ranch, running it with the same integrity and care their father had instilled in them. They married good women and had children of their own, filling the ranch house with the sound of young voices and laughter. Franklin and Violet grew old together, their hair silvering and their steps slowing, but their love deepening with each passing year. They sat on the porch on summer evenings, surrounded by grandchildren playing in the yard, and marveled at the life they had created. When Franklin passed away at 73, peacefully in his sleep with Violet's hand in his, she grieved deeply but without regret. They had made the most of every day they had been given, and the love they had shared had changed not just their lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. Violet lived another 5 years after Franklin's death, spending her time between the ranch with her sons and town with Sarah and her growing medical practice. She continued to write and speak when her health allowed, never tiring of sharing the message that had become her life's work, that abuse was never acceptable, that women deserved safety and respect, and that healing and happiness were possible for those brave enough to pursue them. On a spring morning, much like the one when Franklin had first asked her to visit the ranch, Violet sat in the parlor surrounded by her children and grandchildren. At 81, she was frail but clear-minded, her memories sharp and precious. Sarah sat beside her, holding her hand, and the twins stood by the fireplace, looking so much like their father, it made Violet's heart ache. "Tell us the story again, Grandma," one of the grandchildren pleaded, a girl of about 10 with Sarah's intelligence shining in her eyes. "Tell us about how you met Grandpa." Violet smiled, her voice soft but steady. "I was lost when I came to Fargo, broken by things I had endured. I did not believe I deserved happiness or that good men existed. But then I met your grandfather, and he showed me that I was wrong about everything. He taught me that hope was not just possible, it was real and worth fighting for." "And you lived happily ever after," the girl said with satisfaction. "We did," Violet agreed. "But it was not the kind of happiness you find in fairy tales, where everything is perfect and easy. It was the real kind, built day by day through hard work and love and the choice to keep trying even when things were difficult. That is the best kind of happiness there is because you have to earn it, and once you do, no one can take it away from you." That night, Violet passed away in her sleep, surrounded by the family she had helped create and the love that had sustained her through all the difficult years. At her funeral, held at the ranch with the prairie wind sighing through the grass, Sarah spoke about her mother's courage and resilience. The twins talked about her strength and kindness, and the grandchildren, those small mirrors of a future Violet had helped shape, spoke about the stories she had told them, the lessons she had taught them about hope and perseverance, and the importance of helping those in need. They buried her beside Franklin on a hill overlooking the ranch, where she could watch forever over the land that had given her back her life. The headstone, carved from simple granite, read, "Violet Zimmerman Gates, 1859-1940. She survived. She thrived. She loved. She showed others the way." Years later, when a young woman from the Women's Aid Society visited the ranch while researching the organization's history, Sarah took her to that hill and told her mother's story. The young woman listened with tears streaming down her face, recognizing in Violet's journey echoes of her own struggles and hopes. "She really did it," the young woman said. "She escaped and built a whole new life." "She did more than that," Sarah corrected gently. "She proved that our past does not have to determine our future, that we have the power to change our stories. My mother's message was always the same. No matter how dark things seem, no matter how lost or broken you feel, hope is still possible. Love is still possible. Healing is still possible. You just have to be brave enough to take the first step." The young woman looked out over the ranch, at the house in the distance, and the cattle grazing peacefully, and the endless sweep of prairie under an impossibly blue sky. She thought about her own situation, about the man she needed to leave, and the fear that paralyzed her. Then she thought about Violet Zimmerman Gates, about a woman who had faced those same fears and won. I think I am ready to take that step, she said quietly. Sarah smiled, her mother's strength and compassion shining through her expression. Then let me help you. That is what my mother would have wanted, what she worked her whole life to ensure that no woman would have to face those fears alone. As they walked back down the hill together, the prairie wind carried with it the promise of new beginnings, the echo of a love story that had started with loss and fear, but had bloomed into something beautiful and lasting. Violet and Franklin's legacy lived on not just in their children and grandchildren, but in every woman who found courage in Violet's story, in every man who learned from Franklin's example that true strength lay in gentleness and protection rather than domination. The wild Dakota prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and unforgiving, but also capable of sustaining life and beauty if tended with care and respect. It was the perfect metaphor for the human heart Violet had once written in one of her articles. Both could be wounded, could seem barren and hopeless, but with patience and love and the courage to keep trying, both could heal and flourish beyond measure. On that distant hill, beneath the simple granite marker, Violet and Franklin rested together as they had lived, side by side, partners in every sense, proof that even the most broken souls could find wholeness again, that even the deepest darkness could give way to light, and that hope, that most essential of human qualities, could survive anything if cherished and protected and passed from one generation to the next. Their story, like the prairie itself, was both harsh and beautiful, marked by struggle, but ultimately defined by the triumph of love over fear, of healing over hurt, of hope over despair. It was a story that deserved to be told and remembered and held up as proof that happy endings were not just the province of fairy tales, but could be claimed by anyone brave enough to believe they were possible and strong enough to fight for them. And so their legacy continued, spreading ripples outward like stones cast into still water, touching lives they would never know, changing futures they would never see, but always carrying forward the essential truth they had learned together on that wild Dakota prairie, that hope was always possible, love was always worth fighting for, and every new dawn brought with it the chance to begin again.